In the 1800s, America had a serious transportation problem, and Pennsylvania had it worse than everyone else. While New York was making tons of money with the Erie Canal and Baltimore was busy building railroads to the west, Pennsylvania was stuck with a mess of canals and a ridiculous system where boats had to be hauled over mountains on rails. Yes, you heard that right. Boats over mountains. So in 1846, Pennsylvania finally got serious and chartered the Pennsylvania Railroad to build a proper rail line from Harrisburg to Pittsburgh. But there was one tiny problem. The Allegheny Mountains were in the way. How do you build a railroad over a mountain? Well, you cannot just go straight up. Trains do not work that way. The grades would be way too steep. So, the early engineers had a meeting. Gentlemen, we need to connect Philadelphia to Pittsburgh, but these mountains are impossible. Can we go around them? That would add 200 miles to the route. Can we tunnel through them? That would take 50 years and bankrupt us. So what do we do? I have no idea. Enter J. Edgar Thomson. Thomson became chief engineer in 1847, and this man was different. He had studied railroads in Europe and actually understood both the engineering and business sides of running a railroad. Thomson looked at the mountains and came up with a brilliant solution. If you cannot go straight up a mountain, you go around it in a giant curve, and that is exactly what he did. In 1854, Thomson's team completed the famous horseshoe curve near Altoona. Picture this, a massive 220-degree curve that wraps around the mountainside like a horseshoe. The curve rises 122 feet while turning through a radius of 1,594 feet. It was one of the most dramatic pieces of railroad engineering in America, and it worked perfectly. Trains could climb the steep mountain grades without breaking their wheels or sliding backward. The horseshoe curve became so famous that people would travel just to see it, and it is still in use today, more than 170 years later. That same year, 1854, the Pennsylvania Railroad finally completed its line from Harrisburg to Pittsburgh. Philadelphia now had a direct rail connection to the west. No more boats over mountains, no more impossible portage railroads, just smooth, reliable train service across the Alleghenies. Pennsylvania had finally caught up to its rivals. But Thomson was not satisfied with just connecting two cities. He wanted to build an empire. Thomson had a simple strategy for expansion: buy everything. In 1857, the Pennsylvania Railroad leased the main line of public works from the state of Pennsylvania. Now it controlled the entire route from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh. But Thomson wanted more. Way more. In 1869, the Pennsylvania Railroad acquired the Pittsburgh, Fort Wayne, and Chicago Railway. That gave it access to Chicago. Then it grabbed lines to St. Louis, then Cincinnati, then Louisville. Before long, the Pennsylvania Railroad had tracks reaching all over the Midwest. But there was one place Thomson really wanted, and that place was New York City. New York was the biggest city in America and the financial capital of the world. But there was a problem. The Hudson River was in the way. So what did the Pennsylvania Railroad do? They decided to tunnel under it. This was insane. No one had ever built tunnels under a major river for railroad traffic. The engineering challenges were enormous, but the Pennsylvania Railroad did not care. They were the Pennsylvania Railroad, and they were going to conquer New York. The project took years and cost a fortune. They built the North River tunnels under the Hudson. They built the East River tunnels connecting to Long Island. And they built Pennsylvania Station right in the heart of Manhattan. When Penn Station opened in 1910, it was magnificent. The architectural firm McKim, Mead & White designed it in the Beaux-Arts style, with soaring spaces modeled after Roman baths. The main waiting room had ceilings 150 feet high. Walking into Penn Station was like walking into a cathedral. It was one of the most ambitious civil engineering projects of the era, and it announced to the world that the Pennsylvania Railroad had arrived. The Pennsylvania Railroad adopted a new slogan, "Standard Railroad of the World," and they meant it. The Pennsylvania Railroad set the standards that everyone else copied. They had the most comprehensive training programs, the strictest operational procedures, and the best safety record. Other railroads would literally copy the PRR engineering standards, signal systems, and operating practices, because the Pennsylvania Railroad did everything right. The company developed a distinctive corporate culture: attention to detail, precision, excellence. If you worked for the Pennsylvania Railroad, you did things the Pennsylvania Railroad way, and that way was considered the best. The PRR was not just a railroad, it was an institution, a symbol of American industrial power, and it was just getting started. The Pennsylvania Railroad was not just building tracks, it was building legends. In 1912, the Pennsylvania Railroad launched the Broadway Limited, its flagship train from New York to Chicago. This was not just a train, it was luxury on rails, fine dining, plush accommodations, and observation cars where you could watch America roll by in style. The Broadway Limited even had a rival. The New York Central Railroad ran the famous 20th Century Limited on the same route. These two trains competed for passengers for decades. It was like Coke versus Pepsi, but with steam engines and white tablecloths. The Pennsylvania Railroad was not content with just fancy passenger trains. It wanted to be a pioneer in technology. In 1915, the Pennsylvania Railroad began electrifying its main line between New York and Washington. It also electrified suburban commuter lines around Philadelphia. This was revolutionary. Electric trains were faster, cleaner, and they did not fill the tunnels under New York and Baltimore with smoke. The system used overhead catenary wires and high-voltage alternating current. It was the future of railroading. The Pennsylvania Railroad built its own locomotives at the Altoona Works, one of the world's premier locomotive construction facilities. In 1914, they introduced the K4s, a Pacific-type steam locomotive. This elegant machine became the railroad's standard passenger engine. They built 425 of them. For decades, if you rode a Pennsylvania Railroad passenger train, chances are a K4s was pulling it. These locomotives were workhorses that just kept running year after year. But the most iconic locomotive the Pennsylvania Railroad ever built was the GG1. Introduced in 1934, the GG1 was designed by Raymond Loewy, and it was a masterpiece. Sleek, streamlined, powerful. These electric locomotives could pull passenger trains at 100 miles per hour. They had smooth welded bodies and the distinctive Pennsylvania Railroad Keystone logo on the side. The GG1 was the perfect combination of form and function. And here's the crazy part. These locomotives served for nearly 50 years. The last GG1 did not retire until 1983. That is almost half a century of service. The Pennsylvania Railroad's freight operations were equally impressive. It moved enormous quantities of coal from Pennsylvania's mines, iron ore for steel mills, manufactured goods, and agricultural products. The railroad developed massive classification yards where freight cars could be sorted and assembled into trains. The Enola Yard near Harrisburg and Conway Yard near Pittsburgh were among the largest in the nation. Everything was running smoothly. The Pennsylvania Railroad was at the peak of its power. Until it wasn't. The Great Depression hit the Pennsylvania Railroad hard. Passenger traffic dropped. Freight traffic collapsed. Revenues fell off a cliff. The Pennsylvania Railroad managed to avoid bankruptcy, but just barely. They cut services, they laid off workers, and they deferred maintenance. The railroad never fully recovered financially, but the Depression was not the only problem. Cars were becoming popular, trucks were stealing freight business, and airplanes were about to make long-distance train travel obsolete. World War II brought a temporary revival. The Pennsylvania Railroad moved massive amounts of military freight and personnel. Trains ran at full capacity around the clock. But there was a catch. The railroad deferred maintenance to keep everything running during the war. By the time the war ended, the equipment was worn out and the company could not afford to replace it. The post-war years were brutal. Interstate highways were being built everywhere. Americans were buying cars and taking road trips. Business travelers were flying instead of taking trains. The Pennsylvania Railroad's passenger services were losing money, but the government forced the company to keep running commuter trains around Philadelphia and New York, even though those trains were financial disasters. The railroad was trapped. It could not abandon unprofitable services, and its profitable freight business was being eaten alive by trucks. Management made things worse. The Pennsylvania Railroad kept paying dividends to shareholders while the infrastructure crumbled. Deferred maintenance on tracks and bridges created safety problems. The company's once legendary operational standards were slipping. And then came the ultimate symbol of decline. In 1963, the Pennsylvania Railroad announced it was going to demolish Pennsylvania Station, that magnificent building with the 150-foot-high ceilings. That architectural masterpiece had announced the railroad's arrival in New York. The company planned to tear it down and replace it with Madison Square Garden and an office building. The destruction was completed in 1966. The loss of Penn Station sparked the historic preservation movement in America. But for the Pennsylvania Railroad, it was a sign that the company was out of options. By the late 1960s, the Pennsylvania Railroad was desperate. We need to merge with someone or we're finished. Who should we merge with? How about our biggest rival? You mean the New York Central? Our enemy for over a century? Yes. Desperate times call for desperate measures. On February 1, 1968, the Pennsylvania Railroad and the New York Central Railroad merged to create Penn Central Transportation Company. This was the largest railroad in the United States, with over 20,000 miles of track. Finally, a solution to all their problems. Except it wasn't. The two railroads had completely different corporate cultures. Their operating systems were incompatible. Management fought constantly. The merger was a disaster. Penn Central lasted exactly 2 years. On June 21, 1970, the company declared bankruptcy. It was the largest corporate bankruptcy in American history at that time. The standard railroad of the world was dead. The federal government eventually stepped in. Conrail took over the freight operations in 1976. Amtrak took over passenger service in 1971. The pieces were salvaged, but the Pennsylvania Railroad was gone. Today, the horseshoe curve is still in use. The New York tunnels still carry trains. Many of the routes are still operated by Amtrak and freight railroads. The Pennsylvania Railroad's legacy lives on in the infrastructure it built. But the company itself, the standard railroad of the world that set the standards everyone else followed, became a cautionary tale about how even the mightiest can fall. And that is the entire story of the Pennsylvania Railroad. Please subscribe for more videos.